Hail adventurers, I am Ethan with the Pixel Arrow Productions, and today we're bringing you something different than my usual content. I'm sure that those of you who have stuck with the channel for a long time are probably wondering about the return of build videos, and for that all I can say is stay tuned. I don't want to overpromise anything, but I can say that I have some things in mind. Today, however, we're beginning a brand new series of video podcasts that has been and will continue to be a labor of love for me. I hope that this won't be just another Elder Scrolls lore podcast, because there are plenty of those out there and many of them are excellent. With this series, though, I want to bring together two of my favorite things in the world, and those things are Elder Scrolls lore and philosophy. I was a student of philosophy and theology at university, and I have a BA in the subject, and I'm continuing to be fascinated by it and learning new things every day. Outside of traditional academics, I've also been a student of Elder Scrolls lore for some time, and I think these two areas of knowledge put me in a place to bring something unique and, I hope, valuable to the Elder Scrolls lore space. If the relationship between skepticism and Elder Scrolls lore, or the metaphysical nature of the Aedra, or the worldview underpinnings of Imperial and Stormcloak perspectives interests you, you might be in the right place. This episode, entitled Prolegomena and the Unreliable Narrator, is going to function as something of an episode 0 for the series. That first word is really just a fancy way to say the things that come before. This episode is going to be a time for me to outline the approaches that I'm going to take, what this podcast is going to be, and how I'm going to accomplish what I'm setting out to do. And that's all going to get wrapped up neatly with the concept of the unreliable narrator, which is a foundational lore concept that some of you might be familiar with already, especially those of you that are more learned about Elder Scrolls lore and deeper into Elder Scrolls lore communities. But I do think I might have something valuable to say even to you about the unreliable narrator that you haven't heard yet. So maybe stick around even if you are familiar with this concept already. That said, let's get into some of those introductory matters that I was talking about. First, the connections I'm going to make between Elder Scrolls lore and philosophical, real theories and understandings are not to say that it's the same thing or that the Elder Scrolls is trying to copy the real world. It's just to kind of help deepen our understanding and work as kind of a tool that we can use to craft theories on how we might understand different aspects of Elder Scrolls lore. Another thing worth mentioning as we get into this deep philosophical look at the Elder Scrolls lore is that it will be helpful for you, the viewer, to bring a basic understanding of the fundamentals of the Elder Scrolls world. Most people who are watching videos like this are already aware of the basics of Elder Scrolls lore, the different planes, the Daedric princes, the gods, the races, what all of those are, and I'm not going to be covering those lore basics in this podcast. There's plenty of other lore podcasts that do that, and they do it very well, so I would recommend, if you're not super familiar with the basics and fundamentals of Elder Scrolls lore, it might be worth going to check some of those out first before returning to this one. Many of you, though, I imagine will already have these basics well underhand. Even just playing the games gives you a pretty good handle on some of these things. So with all that out of the way, let's get into the meat of this first video topic. Elder Scrolls lore is communicated to us through the game via a medium known as the unreliable narrator. I'm not going to be the first or last one to point out that the unreliable narrator is owed quite a bit for how interesting and gripping Elder Scrolls lore is, and just the fact that we're continuing to talk about it today. So what is an unreliable narrator? Well, it's a literary term that refers to any story in which the person who's telling you the story, that is, whoever's words you're reading on the page, is untrustworthy, or you're not entirely certain if what they're telling you is always accurate for some reason or another. Many stories are told with what is called the omniscient narrator, the all-knowing narrator. Basically, if there was somebody who knew everything and all the ins and outs about the story, who's presumably the author, that's who's narrating it to you. But there are some stories in which the narrator is much more subjective. Maybe they're a person in the story or a person who experienced the story. A great example in a recent film that many people might have seen is in The Joker, the first one, not the second one. In the first Joker, most of what we're watching is from the perspective of Arthur, our protagonist. And he has a lot of things going on mentally, and so we get to a point as an audience where we no longer trust what we're seeing because all that we're seeing is from the perspective of Arthur, and those things might not actually be happening. Another example in film that many of you may have seen is the film Fight Club, which I don't want to spoil if any of you haven't seen it, but there's certain things that eventually make it clear that what we're seeing the narrator experience might not be actually what's taking place. A good literary example would be The Catcher in the Rye. Our main protagonist is the narrator of the story, and what he experiences and what he thinks about events might not be objectively the actual case. So any stories like this are said to have an unreliable narrator. But Elder Scrolls is even unique among these in its unreliable narrator. It's not as though we have a single narrator telling us the lore with a single set of characteristics and reasons we might doubt them throughout the entire story. No, the lore in the Elder Scrolls is actually communicated through a multitude, hundreds if not thousands of unreliable narrators that we get to read their thoughts and their perspectives and their understanding of the world. And all of these narrators are unreliable in different ways. Many of the examples of unreliable narrators in film and literature that I brought up are unreliable because they have some mental condition, or maybe they're hallucinating, or maybe they're imagining things to happen, or maybe they're adjusting the truth of what they're telling you in order to give you a certain perspective. And that might be the case with some of the narrators we run across in the books we read in the Elder Scrolls, but the narrators we encounter in the Elder Scrolls are less comparable to somebody like the Joker and more comparable to witnesses in a mystery film. You might have seen some mystery movies in which the investigator interviews a bunch of witnesses, and except for some that might be the murderer or protecting the murderer, they're generally communicating honestly what they remember about the events that they witnessed, and of course those are biased by their perspectives or else limited by the limitations of their memory, but they're being honest and they're kind of trying their best. And I think most Elder Scrolls narrators, whether they're in lore books that we read in game or dialogue that we actually directly experience, should be more comparable to that, and I think we should have a much more charitable interpretation of most Elder Scrolls narrators than a lot of people do. I think it's fair to assume good faith in a lot of the narrators that we read from, and we'll touch on that a little bit more later. But for now, all I want to point out is that there's many different reasons why a narrator might be unreliable, and in the Elder Scrolls we probably could cite a case example of each one. I wanted to bring out here a few examples so that you can see the different ways one might be considered unreliable. The first one I'm going to bring out is from the Pocket Guide to the Empire 3rd edition, and this section, The War with the Trees, Argonia, and Blackmarsh. I'm going into the section about current events, and this is the excerpt we'll be using.
Blackmarsh continues to be a backward land economically by imperial standards. Most of the agriculture is grown by subsistence farmers, though recently more has been shipped abroad, of Tamriel. Banditry appears to be on the decline in recent years, with most criminal acts being perpetrated not by outsiders, but by natives, such as the Naga thugs of Argonian stock.
What's interesting about this is that the Empire is writing its survey of these geographical locations in a supposedly pretty straightforward way. These are mostly a factual, informational, non-fiction books. But you can see the influences of imperial biases here. The idea of it being called a backward land economically, obviously the Argonian farmers are farming pretty much just what they need to survive, whereas the Empire is very minded towards mercantilism, and so the idea of growing only what you need and not having any surplus to sell is backwards in their mind. Now, clearly they're being fairly upfront about these biases, but we need to be aware of what the authors of the books we're reading are bringing to the table. It's also interesting that they say banditry appears to be on the decline in recent years, with criminal acts mostly being committed by natives. However, earlier in this book, the Empire admits that it has very little involvement deeper into the marches, so it doesn't actually have this information, or if it does, it's just kind of from the outer edges of Blackmarsh. And so they're kind of reporting based on their limited knowledge and their imperial perspectives, which makes them an unreliable narrator, not necessarily inaccurate, but we do have reason to call into question some of the things that they say. Another way in which a narrator in the Elder Scrolls might be unreliable is going to be exemplified here by the Songs of the Return, which is a traditional legend of Ysgramor and his 500 companions. This one's interesting in its unreliability in that it is a legend, and primarily a poem before anything else. And so because of that, we have to realize this is not a straightforward historical account. It's a legend of a people's heritage, and so of course they're going to have biases, but not only that, they're also going to probably hyperbolize and make things go a little grander and a little greater in scale and spectacle than perhaps they actually were. It's also possible, we have to keep in mind, that they are reporting things more or less as they happened. But I think you'll see that there's a little bit of dissonance between those two interpretations when we read this excerpt.
When at last the rightful claim of Sarthal had been retaken, driving the murderous elves back to their lofty cities, did great Ysgramor turn and let loose the fearsome war cry that echoed across all the oceans. The 500 who yet stood joined in the ovation for the victory and the lament for their fallen peers. It was said to be heard on the distant and chilling green shores of Atmora, and the ancestors knew their time had come to cross the seas. As the reverberations echoed out and drowned to silence, all looked to Ysgramor, who bore the blessed Wuthrad, for his next commandment. With his lungs that bellowed forth the fury of humanity, he bade them to continue their march, that the devious Mer might know the terror they had brought on themselves with their trickery.
So as you can see, there's quite a bit of bias here. There's a kind of some derogatory language with regarding to the elves. There's the assumption that the elves tricked the Nords, and these could be true things, but they also, you can very easily see how it's possible that the Nords have their own interpretation, and that perhaps the interpretation of the actions of the Falmer by the Snow Elves themselves could be very different. You also see this idea that Ysgramor's voice echoes across the entire Sea of Ghosts, and it's what lets the people in Atmora know that they can sail across the sea. Now, that's technically possible. We're in a land of magic, and the voice is a poorly understood branch of magic at best. So maybe we should take this at face value, but I think we should also consider the fact that this book is a work of poetry and a legend, and so we should probably take some of these reports, especially with the more specific details, with a bit of a grain of salt. Another source of unreliability is just, as I mentioned before, just the sheer lack of omniscience, and I'm going to illustrate this through the use of two books. First, Notes on Racial Phylogeny, 7th edition by the Council of Healers at the Imperial University.
It is less clear whether the Argonians and Khajiit are interfertile with both humans and elves, though there have been many reports throughout the eras of children from these unions, as well as stories of unions with Daedra. There have been no well-documented offspring.
Now, it doesn't say it explicitly here, but generally this book leaves you with the impression that Argonians are, as far as we know, infertile with other races of elves and humans. And I don't think that this is necessarily due to any particular bias, nor do I think it is due to any real racism or desire to deceive us into thinking that the Argonians are infertile with humans. I think that's genuinely what they believe based on the knowledge they have. But in the book The Fall of Vitharn, which recounts the story of a count in the Shivering Isles, we have this line.
Saren's mother and father believed that with the proper political influence, Saren could certainly usurp Sheogorath and carry the Shivering Isles into a prosperous age. For his part, Count Vitharn refused even to acknowledge Sheogorath, thinking himself and his heirs irrefutable rulers of the Isles. This, of course, amused the mad god to no end, and so he allowed the marriage of Saren to Sheen in Glade, daughter of an Argonian midwife who believed that the mortal sphere would afford her daughter nothing but hatred and oppression. Sheen in Glade was as excellent a countess to Saren as any in the Isles could ask for, wanting nothing but to bring pride and honor to her adopted house and court. For years her mind was untouched, even living as she did in the heart of dementia. Alas, none may reside too long in the Isles without the blessing of Lord Sheogorath, and so Sheen in Glade was finally pushed to the brink by the infidelity of her husband, the Count. Saren was obsessively nepotistic and distrustful of anyone with whom he shared no blood relation, including his bride. Though Sheen in Glade bore a son by the Count, who disappeared from the Isles in his 20th year, it is known that the two shared their bed with decreasing frequency as Saren's paranoia grew, and he found himself in the arms of his birth sister Nuela, who bore of their incestuous affair the heir apparent, Cesrian.
So we don't know what race Saren is, but by his name it can be relatively reliably reduced that he's not an Argonian, and yet this Argonian midwife bears him a child. Now you might say that this is the result of being in the realm of the mad god or something like that, but regardless, it does serve as evidence against the presumption of the Imperial Council of Healers that Argonians are infertile with other humans, as far as we know. Now that's the key right there. As far as they know, that's the information that they reported. So as people, with a macro perspective, being able to see accounts of things that happen in Daedric Plains, we can say, oh, well, they were wrong. And so they were unreliable in the sense that they didn't have access to that information, not in the sense that they were untrustworthy in any way. But we do have to be careful when we read anything about Elder Scrolls lore, because it is possible that we run into contradictions, and those contradictions aren't discrepancies on the behalf of the developer. They are simply evidence of the fact that the characters in the story who are writing these lore books for us don't have all the information and don't have all the facts. So why is this method of communicating lore so interesting? Well, first of all, it mirrors our own history, right? Our own real experience. History isn't just a singular, monolithic, here's what happened. There's a lot of study that goes into it. There's a lot of uncertainty. We're piecing together events from accounts of the people that lived through it. And of course, the people that lived through it don't have all the facts, or they have their own perspectives and biases that might change the way they perceive things. And so from all of those things, we have to piece together our best guess at what was actually the case. And so this is the very same in Elder Scrolls, and just as much as the conversation of what's real history is continuing on in the real world, what's real history, what's real physics, what's the reality of the Elder Scrolls world is continuing to go on in the Elder Scrolls. It encourages discussion in a way that some flavor text written by a developer doesn't. It encourages us to try to bring together all the elements that we have, look at the preponderance of the evidence, consider the biases and potential limited perspectives of the narrators were given. And not only is this interesting to spark lore discussion between fans of the series, but it's also just really an ingenious game mechanic if we're going to look at it from a meta perspective. Uncertainty and malleability is a big feature of Elder Scrolls lore, and that offers the developers the ability to make changes and do things the way that they want to, in the way that they think will be the most fun for the game, for the player, for the gaming experience. And it also validates the various player experiences that people have. So your character, in the same way that all the other characters you're reading from, has their own biases, their own opinions, their own subjective perspectives on the world. And so your player perspective, the way you experience something, could be just as accurate as the way that somebody else experiences it. And we see this with the way that the developers treat the protagonists of each game, kind of writing them off and allowing the certainly very large and influential events to sort of remain in this uncertain state. And it works well to do that because everything in the game is uncertain, not just the events that happen in the game that you experience. Everything in Elder Scrolls lore should be viewed in light of this idea. We're told about this world from the perspective of real people who inhabit it. People with their own characteristics, their own personalities, their own predispositions, their own perspectives, and not an omniscient, all-knowing developer ex machina telling us how things are. This means that there's a lot of interpretations of things that are possibly true or partially true, and throughout this series that's going to be a common theme where I'm going to be bringing you multiple perspectives of different narrators that we have within the Elder Scrolls lore on a topic, and going to be trying to usually piece different parts of them together. It's not often the case that one of them is correct and the other one's incorrect. They probably all have pieces of the truth that I'm going to try to assemble for you in these little lectures and give you my opinion on how things might have happened based on the evidence. And I think that's going to be what's going to make this podcast fun for both of us. Now, let's not take this whole matter of the unreliable narrator too far, because that just leads to what I call lore skepticism. I can't tell you how many times I've gone through Reddit or Discord searching for interesting Elder Scrolls theories and come across a super fascinating and engaging discussion, only to have one of these lore skeptics come into the picture and ruin the fun for everybody. There's two basic types of lore skepticism, as I call it. The first one is based on this whole unreliable narrator idea. It basically says that the in-game source that whatever theory you're crafting relies on is actually unreliable or might be unreliable, and therefore there's no point in engaging with your idea, or some people will even say you're flat out wrong. Another type of lore skepticism is just simply to say, well, you can't prove for 100% certain that that's true, so it's not true. That's of course a logical fallacy. To say that it might be the case that something's not true, so it's not true, is obviously wrong. So, if we're going to be a little more charitable and take perhaps the best version of this argument, you might say, you can't know this for certain, or your source might be unreliable, so there's no point in entertaining that idea until we can prove it more thoroughly. Basically through direct in-game experience or something like that. Even in its most charitable form, this is a low-level and uninteresting criticism, and I think it basically has no place in any Elder Scrolls lore discussions, or really any discussions at all. To understand why I think lore skepticism is so pointless, let's take a look at real philosophical skepticism for a moment. Maybe the most famous philosophical skeptic is René Descartes, a French philosopher most famous for his Meditations, and the first two of those. In the first two Meditations, he runs himself through an exercise where he doubts every single one of his beliefs in order to come to only beliefs that he can believe are true with 100% certainty. By the second meditation, all he really has is that he exists. You may have heard the famous quote, "I think, therefore I am," and what Descartes means by this is that if you ask the question, am I real or do I exist, you thereby prove that you exist, because if you didn't, there would be no question. Now, Descartes actually has 4 or 5 more meditations after this, which are a lot less famous, but Descartes actually didn't set out to make everybody a skeptic. He didn't set out to say, in order to believe anything, you have to have 100% certainty of your beliefs. Rather, this was more of a thought experiment he was running himself through to make a point, and that point was essentially that you could, using reason, build up all the beliefs that you have on reason alone, and that's what he attempts to do in the following meditations. Many people think he's unsuccessful at that, and because of that, they're a lot less popular and well-known than his first two. So let's say that the critics of Descartes' 3rd through 6th meditations are correct, and he's actually unsuccessful in building up a completely undoubtable framework of beliefs. What does that leave us with? Well, unless any of us are confident that we can succeed where Descartes has failed and actually build up a completely undoubtable belief system, something that I've never heard any skeptic claim that they're able to do, we're basically left in a place where we have the knowledge that we exist, and that's all. This leads me to the 2 primary objections to skepticism. One of the philosophical objections is that it actually assumes another belief that is not based on anything. Skepticism first assumes that in order to have knowledge, you have to first be 100% certain of the belief that you're adopting. And there's actually no basis for that, that's just assumed in skepticism. So, by its own standards, it fails. But the criticism I'm more interested in for the purpose of this discussion is the prudential criticism. Let's ask ourselves, what is the point of a philosophy or a worldview? Hey, this is me cutting in while I'm editing. I'm listening to myself make this point, and I think it's still a good one, but I do want to narrow the focus of what I'm talking about. Here I'm trying to define what I think the purpose of a philosophy is, but I think philosophy is too broad of a term, and I want to narrow my focus to really what I mean here is an epistemological philosophy. That is a philosophy which defines what knowledge is and how it's acquired. I think the point is still a good one, but I think I really should define my term as epistemological philosophy. What's the point of that? Not any philosophy in general. Anyway, carry on. I think most of us would agree that it's something like harmonization with truth, or, in other words, making sure that the person who holds the philosophy has more true beliefs than they might without it. And skepticism fails by this metric too. Rather than expanding the amount of true beliefs one holds, it actually limits it to just 1, or 2 if you also assume that you need 100% certainty to have knowledge. And limiting your whole worldview to 2 beliefs really makes things very difficult. It doesn't accomplish the purpose of a philosophy that we've already established, and it also makes living just impossible and pointless. If you were to get out of bed in the morning, as a skeptic, you would have to ask yourself, am I in bed? Why am I getting out of bed? Is it the morning? Do I have a body? What is the point of doing any of this? And your time would be better served trying to figure out much more basic propositions rather than getting up and out of bed. When you speak to somebody, as a skeptic, you'd have to ask, does this other person even exist? And if they do or don't, what's the point of me talking to them? Especially if they don't exist, then I'm just sitting there having a conversation with myself, or worse, some other thing that wants to deceive me. And so as a true skeptic, you end up in this place where you can't live properly, and you actually have no purpose of living. And lore skepticism has very much the same problem. We asked earlier, what's the point of a philosophy? Well, what's the point of studying Elder Scrolls lore? I think most of us could agree that it's to understand the world of these games that we like so much, so that the characters we play in them feel more grounded and real within it. Lore skepticism reduces, not expands, this pool of beliefs or understanding. Only directly experienced events in the games, things you've done or experienced in Skyrim or Oblivion or Morrowind, can be taken as actually canon or actually 100% proven. Anything else, any further extrapolation, is not proven and therefore uninteresting to the lore skeptic. And this brings me to the other purpose of studying Elder Scrolls lore, which is to have fun. Ignoring interesting theories or ending discussions because they can't be 100% proven as fact, or because the in-game sources they're based on might be unreliable, is just simply not fun. I certainly can tell you that I find that pretty uninteresting. I want to emphasize that I'm not saying that you should just believe anything anyone tells you about Elder Scrolls lore in the name of fun. Accepting things without criticism isn't really fun either. But your critiques should really be based on one of two things. You either think that the internal logic of a particular theory or perspective is flawed, or you think that theory or perspective conflicts with other known Elder Scrolls lore. That's what leads to some interesting and engaging discussions, and we might actually get closer to understanding the reality of the Elder Scrolls universe. Just stating that the theory is pointless because no one can prove it for sure accomplishes neither of those things. I think we all know that there's a big difference between offering a good faith criticism of an argument and just being a pedantic milk drinker. So, all that to say, I really have no interest in this trend of lore skepticism that I see all across Elder Scrolls lore discussions, unreliable narrator or not. It isn't fun, and it doesn't lead to a better understanding of this awesome world we're all so enamored with, so I'll be leaving it out of any videos that I make, and I would highly encourage all of you to do the very same in the discussions in the comments below. Before we get really deep into the epistemology of the Elder Scrolls, I want to further nuance this idea of the unreliable narrator and how we should approach it when thinking about lore, and especially theory crafting. And I want to do that through the lens of charity. Some of you may have heard of this. It's one of the cardinal virtues, actually, but the way that I'm using it here is in a logical context. Charity, at its core, is basically assuming goodwill first. The baseline assumption of when you're speaking to anybody, if you're being charitable, is that they are being honest, they actually believe what they're telling you, and they're not trying to deceive you. And I think this is the perspective that we should take when we look at lore given to us by in-game sources, whether that's by a narrator in a book or a NPC's dialogue. It's basically an innocent until proven guilty mentality. So rather than looking at every source and saying, this is unreliable, so I'm not going to buy it, instead, you have to actually prove why you think it's unreliable. And so I'm not saying that we should always assume that everybody's telling the truth and is correct, because if we have a significant amount of evidence that they're lying, or they might be biased, or have some other reason that we might consider them unreliable, we should absolutely take that into account when we're theory crafting or discussing lore. But generally speaking, the best approach is to assume that whoever's telling us this information is doing so as reliably as they reasonably can. This charitable approach is broadly our approach to real history too, in real life. If someone that was there at the time of whatever event we're studying tells us something, we tend to believe them. Sometimes we even take this approach for people who weren't actually there. The Battle of Thermopylae with the Spartans against the Persians is a great example. The Battle of the 300, as some people call it. Herodotus really offers the only complete account that I'm aware of. He wasn't there. He's got certain biases because he's Greek, and obviously the enemy was the Persians. And yet, we take his account as more or less fact, and that's partially because we don't have much else to go on, but also partially because we would need to provide some very specific evidence that he is trying to deceive us, or he is being unreliable in some other way. Now, of course, we don't treat his account as complete certainty, but we already been over in our skepticism section how we rarely know anything with complete certainty, and so to treat history any differently doesn't really make a ton of sense. And so I think it's fair to believe him, in large part because his account is one of the only ones that we have. And so what else are you going to do? You either make no conclusions and kind of just throw your hands in the air and say, well, it's unreliable, so maybe, the Battle of Thermopylae never happened. But I don't think that's a useful or helpful approach to history, and I certainly don't think it's a useful or helpful approach to Elder Scrolls lore. I think if you were to look at every source of history in the Elder Scrolls and assume that it was unreliable and ignore it, you would not know very much about Elder Scrolls lore at all. It's also, I think, worthwhile to point out that you do this in real life, too. If you meet somebody and they tell you that they went to the park yesterday or played basketball, you tend to believe them. They might have any number of reasons that they could be lying to you. Maybe they actually just sat at home on the couch all day and ate potato chips, but they want you to think they're cool, so they tell you they did something more active or interesting. But you would need a decent amount of evidence to convince you that that was the case. For the most part, when somebody tells you something, you believe them, and I don't see any reason for that to change when we're looking at history or Elder Scrolls lore. But even if our criticism is not that things are biased or that people are deceiving us, but just that, the narrator might not have all the facts, well, what else are you going to do besides believe them? I would point you back to the example of the Battle of Thermopylae. Look, we might have any number of reasons to think that Herodotus didn't have all of the facts, but it is what we have, and I think it's probably more accurate to believe Herodotus and have some information about the Battle of Thermopylae, whether or not all of it is accurate, than to just assume he doesn't have all the facts, so we're just gonna, throw that away. I think the Elder Scrolls is the same. Look, you could definitely say that most of the narrators probably don't have all the facts, and they're probably telling us lore that is incomplete or contains some inaccuracies. And I think it's perfectly okay to grant that, and to also say, we're going to move forward taking this account as fact, because we don't have anything else to go on. Now, maybe some account that you read doesn't actually take into account all of the evidence, or there's something else that makes that account not quite make sense, and that's where your own theorizing and your own theory crafting comes into play, and that's a lot of what this podcast is going to be about. But unless I think that that's necessary for some reason, for the most part, I intend to treat the narratives that we encounter through the Elder Scrolls games as basically accurate. Now, this idea of assuming goodwill, this idea of charity, also extends to logical arguments too. Where lore sources contend each other, I will try to steelman each side. And to understand what I mean by steelman, we need to look at its opposite, a logical fallacy known as the straw man. Strawmanning an argument is basically taking a argument that an opponent's making and constructing a sort of weaker version of it and arguing against that rather than the point that's actually being made. But I think strawman actually extends further than that. Even if your opponent is actually making a weak argument, if we're pursuing truth and not just victory and some sort of back and forth, we want to actually argue against the best version. So you want to create the best version of your opponent's argument. So setting up an opponent's argument in the best light possible is known as steelmanning. Basically, you're increasing the strength and increasing the validity of the argument that they're making, so that when you argue against it, it's more clear that yours is superior. I'll make sure to take this approach of steelmanning whenever I read two lore sources that conflict, so I'll kind of give reasons as to why you might believe one over the other in both directions. And I'll also attempt to make steelman counterpoints to my own theories, not just in-game sources. So again, the foundation of charity is always to assume goodwill and to wait for anything else besides goodwill, whether that's deception or insanity or lack of knowledge, to be proven, innocent until proven guilty. And when it comes to argumentation, it also means trying to put out counterpoints in the best light possible. I'll try to be conducting my lore analysis through this series with that charitable outlook, and if I ever slip up in that, feel free to call me on it. And that, my fellow adventurers, brings us to the end of the list of topics I had to cover in episode 0 of our new series. We talked about what this podcast is going to be and how I'm going to conduct it. We talked a little bit about the unreliable narrator, what that is in the Elder Scrolls context, and how we ought to treat it. We talked about lore skepticism and how it contributes to the degradation of conversations in the Elder Scrolls lore space, and how it's best to be avoided, generally speaking. And finally, we talked a little bit about charity, how we ought to treat the authors of the lore within the Elder Scrolls universe with a bit of grace and a bit of a innocent until proven guilty mentality. So with all that in mind, I want to thank you all so much for joining me. I have been Ethan, this has been the Pixel Era Productions, you have all been incredible, and I will see you in the next video.